Daranistara, Siza Keith Blake Ata, Tuskana Hakaja. Welcome everyone. Today, this portion of the conference is in relation to community policies, policing, and enforcement of cannabis. My name is Keith Blake. I'm the Chief of Police at the Tsuut'ina Nation. On behalf of the men and women of Tuskana, I welcome you all here. We hope you're enjoying your stay. And I've had a chance to listen to a lot of the presentations yesterday and today, and there's been some excellent conversations, so we hope to contribute to that. We have a very distinguished panel with us today. We have Sarah Mainville, who's been giving some of her perspective in previous presentations, as well as she'll be speaking of community policies today. We have Chief Dwayne Zachary from Kahnawake Peacekeepers. Dwayne is the Chief of Police there. He is also the President of the First Nation Chiefs of Police Association. Next to him, we have Inspector Earl Neaney from the RCMP. And next to him, we have Corporal Richard Novak from the RCMP. There's going to be some presentations that I'll get to very shortly. I will offer each one of our panelists to introduce themselves and discuss the topics they're speaking of. Before we do, I just wanted to provide some brief information in regards to our service, our police service, and our community. When we were advised that this was going to become legalized cannabis, we as a community as well as a police service knew we had to get out there and understand what that meant. So our council reps, 2 of our council representatives, our general counsel, and 3 of our police officers in February traveled to Seattle. That community had legalized marijuana some time ago. We wanted to see the impacts of that. We spoke to the police department in Seattle. We spoke to government city officials to try and understand how that impacted their community. We then went to Tulalip and Trialip, and we went to the tribes to find out how that impacted their community. And now that we are just over a month into legalization, I can tell you the sky hasn't fallen. There's been really very little change in what we're doing as a police service. But what we're trying to focus on in Tsuut'ina, and what our community has spoken loud and clear, is that there was a vote that occurred on our nation. And the vote was put to the people. Do you want to have cannabis produced, manufactured, and sold on the nation? And that vote was overwhelmingly yes. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 93% was yes. So that gave us a mandate from a police perspective. We needed to prepare for this. We need to ensure that not only is our community safe, but we're delivering education to the community, to our youth. We're presenting in community forums, which we have on 2 occasions, where we bring in health experts. We bring in policing officials. So we kind of try that wraparound approach to understanding what the legalization means for us. One of the other things that I wanted to bring up is the fact that our community has been very supportive of policing, and I know in the First Nation policing program across the country there's some challenges that we in self-administered police services have that what you would call your traditional policing model don't have. We're underfunded, we're understaffed, our equipment isn't to the same levels as others. And we're fighting that fight, and I know that Dwayne will be speaking specifically to that. He's a very strong advocate of all of us in self-administered police services. A little bit of history about Tuskana is that we have a long history here on the nation. The black soldiers, they protected the tribe, they protected the camp. That tradition continued. Even when the RCMP came in and had policing jurisdictions, we still had Tuskana, we still had nation members that was doing that work in the community. In 2004, we received full policing accreditation, and now we are a self-administered police service. In Alberta, there's 3 self-administered. There's Lakeshore Police Service, there's the Blood Tribe Police Service, and there's us, the Tsuut'ina Nation Police Service. We're very proud that we're one of 3. We're very proud that we have strong community support. We, in Alberta, have no tiered policing as in some provinces. We undergo the same standards and audits that the Calgary Police Service, Edmonton Police Service, all 11 police services in Alberta have. We must undertake those, and we, again, meet those standards just like anyone else. Our police officers have the same authorities as every police officer in Alberta. So again, we are equal to any police service in Alberta and additionally in Canada. So without further ado, I would like to start with Sarah. She has a presentation, and please, Sarah, take it away.
Miigwech Buju, Kabamishi Panisi Kwe Indigenous Makwato Dem, Kuchiching Ndoji. It's a pleasure to be here with you for the past day and a half and to make this presentation of the work that I do for First Nations. This is not the presentation. It's the orange OKT. So I've been working with First Nations in consulting the community about whether or not the community wants the First Nation to take on a governance role over cannabis. And so what I've done in the work that I do, because I've worked with several First Nations, is I actually put the policy choices in front of the community at community meetings. I'm a strong believer in doing engagement with the community about those policy choices as opposed to any one entity designing the policy for everybody as a representative government. So I do agree that sovereignty, in my language, we don't say sovereignty, we say minigozawin. It's what the Creator had given us, and that's collectively as a people. And so that those community meetings are crucial in making decisions about where to go with cannabis. So I'm going to talk about how the law has changed. Briefly, I don't want to be repetitive of what you've already learned in the last day and a half. I'm also going to share some understanding of some of the legal options for chief and council and communities, and also consideration what is the best policy tool or the lawmaking tool to utilize. And again, reiterating that point that consultation is key to ensure that your community has ownership about whatever policy, regulation, or law that you choose to undertake. So we've heard this from Health Canada that they have decided that to create this watertight system and it's devoid of First Nation participation. And I had mentioned that to them last night, that the Federal Court of Appeal is very clear that when you undertake consultation, you have to undertake it with a goal of trying to accommodate the needs, interests, and rights of the people you are consulting. And this is out of the Trans Mountain case. And so basically coming to sessions like this and taking notes is not enough. You need to ensure that this system accommodates the sovereign rights and interests of First Nations, and unfortunately it doesn't. I've been looking at different models. For example, I've been looking at the Saskatchewan Indian Gaming Authority model and just wondering if there is solutions already out there for First Nations to take on their own authority, either in partnership with other governments or is sovereign inherent authority. And so that's the work that I undertake on behalf of my clients. So what we know is that under the Federal Cannabis Act, this is the section where Canada has decided that it unilaterally will give the right to provinces to create licensing regimes. And this has been done without consultation with First Nations and certainly without our free, prior, and informed consent. So that's a problem. And that's why we need to start working together to suggest a solution to this problem. So what happened on October 17th? October 17th was all about legalizing recreational use. I know that we've talked a lot about medicinal cannabis and the important solution that it has to our health needs and our economic growth, but legal recreational use is something also that we have to have important conversations about. In Ontario, for example, and in other provinces, the wholesaler, the province has taken a monopoly upon themselves to be the wholesaler of recreational cannabis. And the provinces themselves have designed, through their model of sharing excise tax, of course 75% of the excise tax goes to the provinces, 25% to Canada, up to a point, and then it goes to the provinces as well. So that 25%, we've been told by the province of Ontario, that's where you have to go, First Nations, if you want a share of the excise tax. You have to go to Canada, and that's unfortunate. The provinces will say, well, we have jurisdiction over you, but we don't have jurisdiction over you, but we have jurisdiction over you. And it's kind of a quandary that we're always dealing with. I also, in my opinion, dispensaries are still operating illegally, but we can have conversations about that as well. I'm going to skip over these. but certainly I can make my slideshow available. But I want to talk about the current state of the law with medicinal cannabis. So we have some, the folks mentioning these Supreme Court cases or other cases. All of these cases with medicinal cannabis are about charter rights. It's about Section 7 of the Charter and your own personal integrity and your right to have health solutions if you have health issues. And of course, medicinal cannabis is seen to have been evidenced to deal with a whole bunch of health issues in a very a good way. So in 2015, we had the Smith decision about the medical marijuana regime being unconstitutional. Then we also had the Allard decision, and this is about the growing your own supply of medical cannabis in your personal residence. That's the Allard decision. And some very creative people have used that decision to create opportunities for medical dispensaries. But the whole idea around this is about your Section 7 charter rights to have access to medical cannabis in a number of ways, not just through licensed producers, not just through ordering online through licensed producers, but also producing for your own personal consumption. And certainly edibles is something that's legal for folks who are producing for their own personal consumption. This is not producing for market consumption. And of course, another important thing that happened October 17th, that the licensing system is now under the Federal Cannabis Act. So we have this regime about licensing, the Health Canada licensing system. Health Canada has gone through a lot of this information, but just to say that, again, we can say without a doubt that there is not enough accommodations for First Nations to participate in becoming cultivators and to work in distributing medical or recreational cannabis under this regime, and that's a problem. So there are gaps to fill. And what we know and what we don't know as far as the gaps is there's definitely relationships that have to be defined if this watertight system is going to accommodate First Nations. Or I think we collectively we have to decide how we are going to create our own Indigenous watertight system of cannabis. And I think that certainly is something at minimum we can leverage in our discussions with other governments. Let's skip through. So most of the provincial legislation has been required to have some kind of way to allow First Nations in on the retail side. And so, for example, this is the Ontario legislation under one of the acts for the cannabis retail. And it basically allows for the government to establish agreements with First Nation governments about retail sales on reserve. And of course, there's lots of policy and lots of regulations to be introduced, and some discussions. I certainly sit at tables with some of my clients on government-to-government tables to discuss how this is going to work. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of legal imagination around this, because provinces, as many of you well know, different negotiation tables, provinces are loath to give away jurisdiction. They want you at most to harmonize your jurisdiction with theirs, and there's not a lot of legal imagination around co-governing cannabis. So there's a lot of work to do around this. And certainly, I think the best legislation, and it's certainly not perfect, it is the BC legislation around encouraging participation for BC First Nations to be involved in cannabis. So why are we talking about provincial law? Well, unfortunately, in the 1980s, Supreme Court of Canada did subscribe to the idea that First Nation reserves were federal enclaves. Legally, they were just the domain of federal laws. Unfortunately, since the 1980s, the Supreme Court and other courts have changed course. And this is really the culmination of this case in 2013, mostly known for is an Aboriginal title case. But basically what it talks about, this federal doctrine about interjurisdictional immunity. Basically, if you're talking about Indians and lands reserved to Indians, we oust provincial law. What the Chilcotin case stands for here is that we expect provincial and federal law in their own divisions of powers to work together hand in hand in areas like health, in areas like the environment, in areas like child welfare. And that's unfortunate. That's an unfortunate development as we become more and more colonized, and you see sort of remnants of the 1969 welfare, or the 1969 red paper, or white paper, sorry. And so you see that coming as more and more provincial jurisdiction is happening on our reserves, and you see sort of all kinds of tripartite agreements happening because it's the art of the possible, really. I can't really criticize First Nation governments from working with provincial governments because we all know that our children and our youth need opportunities. So this is happening, and it's certainly supported by courts across Canada, and most notably the Supreme Court of Canada. So exercise of jurisdiction. We can go here with Section 81 of the Indian Act, and certainly some of my clients have gone here and developed bylaws, for example, dealing with the opioid crisis, creating trespass laws so they can get drug dealers out of their communities. Some of them have considered Section 81 as a sort of fail-safe way to deal with cannabis and to have moratoriums or prohibitions on cannabis sales on the reserve. And so that's an option. There also was an option under Section 85(1) to deal with the prohibition of cannabis as an intoxicant. Of course, Canada is not helping us here. Canada has also said in some of the Senate hearings, we don't think this section actually can do that. We don't think that First Nations under the Indian Act, under Section 85(1), can get cannabis under the intoxication or intoxicants clause. Because of the way that the French reading of the legislation encapsulates what an intoxicant is. That doesn't help us and doesn't help anybody. And unfortunately, this is sort of the hands-off approach that Canada has almost every stage of dealing with cannabis, and the legalization of cannabis around First Nations has been. I mean, this is sort of, sort of the. Unfortunately, it would have been something easy to fix, but they didn't bother to fix it. And this leads into the other presentations. And one of the issues around regulations or laws by First Nations is the enforceability. And a lot of the advice I give to my First Nation clients is to create a law, a solid law that has procedural fairness in it so that people have certain rights. Certainly the government has certain responsibilities, but that it's underlying all of this, it's fair. And that's the kind of laws that we're creating together, dealing with controlling cannabis and creating some independent boards to deal with the licensing factor so that we can create a law that is seen as fair and clear. So the exercise of inherent jurisdiction is something that has come up a lot in this conference, and I think that's important. It's certainly what my practice is all about, is about Indigenous law and inherent jurisdiction, and that is why in my opening remarks I talked about the importance about being careful, because we are at the crux of actually having sort of a groundswell of Indigenous jurisdiction being talked about. There's, in fact, the University of Windsor is hosting an Indigenous law conference as we speak. And so it's really, really important that we don't lose this groundswell because we have taken the wrong subject matter to the wrong court. And certainly a court that doesn't understand Indigenous jurisdiction. So we do have to be careful in how we exercise it. And certainly there are better tools. People are surprised when I tell them that the Indian Act actually does recognize inside of it, some of the governing powers inside the Indian Act actually does recognize inherent jurisdiction. And there's the old Campbell and BC case that also recognizes that under the division of powers that Canada and Ontario haven't exhausted jurisdiction, so that Indigenous inherent jurisdiction doesn't survive that. Indigenous jurisdiction does survive that. And my final point is on Section 88 of the Indian Act. This is what most lawyers will tell First Nations that want to exercise their sovereign jurisdiction around cannabis. Most lawyers will say, well, the province has the authority to license cannabis because of Section 88 of the Indian Act. The elder had talked about Section 88 of the Indian Act, subject to any treaty. Of course, you have treaty rights, but also Section 88 only allows in laws of general application vis-a-vis Indians. It doesn't allow laws of general application in vis-a-vis reservation land. So there is important shield for Indigenous jurisdiction in Section 88 that some of us have forgotten about, but it's actually when a province tries to regulate land-based activities, then they are running afoul of the shield that exists in the Indian Act. So going forward, finally to wrap up, cannabis for most Indigenous peoples is a foreign substance, and certainly there are some exceptions. If you're already dealing with tobacco, then you should also be dealing with cannabis. They're similar, but also very different. Know about the health impacts, be educated on some of the certainly medicinal benefits of cannabis. But it should be the community themselves that decide the path forward. There's an important educational element about cannabis and empowerment about communities deciding for themselves what the path forward is with cannabis is anything. And it's certainly good days ahead when we start doing this more and more often as Indigenous governments, is bringing the community in and letting the communities decide. That's about self-determination. Miigwech.
Thank you, Sarah. What we're going to do today is our presenters will have a moment to speak, present, and then at the end of it, if you have any questions, you can hold your questions to the end, and then we'll hopefully be able to answer those. So I'd like to call upon Chief Zachary now to speak on the First Nation issues relating to the legalization of cannabis.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Dwayne Zachary. I'm the Chief Peacekeeper for the Kahnawake Peacekeepers, just outside of Montreal. I'm also president of the First Nation Chiefs of Police Association. And one of the things I wanted to speak to you today about was how the things that happen in our communities impact policing in our communities, right? I'm talking from the standpoint of standalone First Nation departments. Some of your communities may or may not have a standalone department, but if you do, there are many issues that affect us, and the legalization of cannabis is another wrinkle on top of that that affects us and impacts the resources that the very minor resources that we do receive, right? So there's a real push from the FNCPA with the, I'll call them partners, right? The federal and provincial governments to provide funding, to provide training, to provide equipment, to provide infrastructure for First Nation policing. That's not happening. It's not happening at a rate that's appropriate for First Nation policing to continue to exist at the level that we need it. And the bottom line in all of this, and I've heard a lot of the presentations, it's about, from my perspective, right, from what I heard, it's about safety and security in our communities. And I think that's paramount to all of us, right, safety and security. So when people talk about policing, I've heard some comments about people feeling like, you know, maybe policing is against this. It's not the case, right? It's the law of the land now, and I know in certain communities you want to legalize it. You want to have your own laws to deal with it and to regulate it, which is great. I think that's the responsibility of the leaders in your community, as well as the community, the communities themselves, the people from your communities. But where I'm coming from is we have a responsibility, everyone in our community, to ensure that everyone is safe and secure. So I'm not for or against the cannabis per se, right? But what I am for is safety and security in our communities. And I'm against people being hurt or harmed, whatever that means, right? So we have to take the responsibility, and the onus is on every one of us in our community to deal with that. So back to the issue. First Nation policing is struggling, you know, and we're struggling in a way that resources aren't there for us. We don't have the manpower, we don't have the infrastructure, we don't have the equipment, and if you look at some of the stats, First Nation communities have some of the highest rates for calls, right? So we're out there, we're doing our jobs, but at the same time, you know, we're just trying to deal with the issues that happen. And if we want to build and become better and stronger and have safer communities, then we need to build all of the entities in our community. So that way everything is good. You know, policing, health, safety, education, all of these things I've heard talked about here at this conference, but we have to do more, and we have to be more proactive about the things that we do. So I know there are other presenters, and I'm looking forward to fielding a bunch of questions on First Nation policing. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I'll free up some space for the other presenters. Thank you.
Thanks, Dwayne. And as he spoke of, we do have challenges that other police services do not have. And I think that's not unique in our community, whether it be education, health. We do have significant challenges in funding and doing the things that our community expects. We're not asking to do more than they're doing in our neighbors over in Calgary. We're just asking not to do less, not being provided less. So I just want to introduce Inspector Earl Neaney. I know Corporal Richard Novak will be doing a presentation, but I'm just going to give Earl a chance just to say hello and go from there. Earl?
Good morning. My name is Earl Neaney. I'm the Indigenous Policing Officer for the RCMP here in Alberta. One of my roles is to ensure that we build bridges between the RCMP and the First Nations communities here in Alberta. And when it comes to the cannabis legislation, I want to convey that we, as the RCMP, want to take a measured approach. We want to take a collaborative approach. We want to work with our First Nations communities to build a healthy, safe environment for your community. And in saying that, we look forward to discussions and talking and building those bridges so that you can go about your business. Thank you.
Thank you, Earl. I'd like to bring up Corporal Richard Novak. So Richard is the provincial coordinator for the Drug Recognition Expert Program. He's got a presentation, and I think it's very informative.
Hello, thank you very much for having me here. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk with you about what it is police do to combat impaired driving in our province. So I'm the provincial coordinator of the Drug Recognition Expert Program in Alberta. I'm stationed in Edmonton. I've been a police officer for about 11 years now, and I've been a drug recognition expert since 2011. So I'm going to give some context of what we've done with alcohol, how we enforce that, how we conduct investigations, and how that relates to how we conduct cannabis impaired driving or any drug impaired driving investigation. I'm going to provide some Canadian context to how we've developed our impaired driving techniques compared to other countries. I'm going to define what a standardized field sobriety test is. And please excuse all the acronyms, there's a lot. I'll try and not use too many, I'll try and say the full words. The other big one is drug recognition expert. It's the bigger level of impaired driving investigations with drugs. I'm gonna briefly go over the DRE process and the future of impaired driving that's coming real quick here. So this is a fancy thing some scientists told me is a chemical structure for alcohol. And this is the psychoactive substance in beverage alcohol. This is what has an established illegal limit in the criminal code of what cannot be, like 80 milligram percent of alcohol in 100 milliliters of blood is what cannot be in your system, that or greater, while you're driving a vehicle. And we all are very familiar with alcohol, right? 5% in beers, 12% alcohol in most wines. Spirits usually have a 40% alcohol content. The safe use guidelines, according to the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction, is 10 to 15 units per week. Each one of those units are 3 to 4 or less per occasion, depending on your gender, age, sex. 0 while operating motor vehicles, 0 while taking other drugs or medication. Many people believe it's okay to drive with a certain amount of alcohol in your system, but it's an impairing substance. It shouldn't be in your body at all, and we want to reinforce that there is no safe level of intoxicating substance while operating a motor vehicle. They're not designed for that. So to compare it, here's the chemical structure for the active main ingredient that we're concerned about in cannabis, which is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. And this is the one that has a limit established in how much can be in your blood, and that would be 5 nanograms per liter of blood. But we don't know much about this as we do alcohol, right? We don't have an established 5% THC per joint or per oil or per edible, right? Back in the 1980s and before, a single joint had about 3% THC content. Now we're getting upwards of 30% in the plant with refined practices and growing and hydroponics, and then concentrated oils are getting up to over 95%, and that's including shatter and other different ways of taking that substance out of the plant. That oil that extracted anything can be introduced into food, and this is where a big concern comes from, is how are we going to control that? How are we going to market it and so it's not attractive to children, right? There's a big issue with gummy bears and food that is attractive to children. So we want to keep this as a safety-centered approach. THC absorption. We're not as confident with THC as we are with alcohol. THC absorption in the body differs 30 to 60% per person, and we're not sure why. If you introduce alcohol into that, that increases the absorption rate and creates greater level of impairment. That's another great concern, is about mixing those two substances together. And according to Health Canada, frequent abuse can lead to all types of increased risks, especially with this high potency drug that's getting out there. So cannabis and the public impact. I'm just gonna keep turning away from you guys, I'm really sorry. Physical and mental health, how it affects that in the long and short term of the use of the drug. Potency control, increased accessibility for our youth. The intense smell from personal cultivation. Police are already getting a lot of complaints about this and how it's affecting their children, that secondhand exposure. Cannabis-related impaired driving and its detection. It's a really big hot topic right now. And of course, impairment in the workplace, impairment on the roads, how this is affecting us as a society. So basically, if anything makes you feel different, it will make you drive different. And that's an advertisement from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. That's one of the governing bodies of the drug impaired driving program in Canada. So impaired driving, why it's a concern? Impaired driving is a leading cause of crime-related death in Canada. Based on testing of fatally injured drivers, it is estimated that 1,273 of these deaths resulted from crashes in which an individual was positive for alcohol and/or drugs. In 2014, Alberta collision stats alone, we had 369 deaths and over 18,000 injured. About half of every collision statistic where there's serious injury, half of those are related to alcohol or drugs. So the criminal code, it's an offense to drive while impaired by anything, substance, drugs, or alcohol, or a combination of both. This is a very brief slide. I'll just really skim over it. Basically that 1,230 people were tested by the Manitoba Public Insurance in 2016 with a very preliminary roadside drug detection kit that only tested for these 3 drugs: marijuana, cocaine, opioids, benzodiazepines, amphetamines, and methamphetamine. And that still, out of this portion of the population, 1 out of 10 had a drug in their system 53% were marijuana, 31% cocaine, 12% opioids, 2% for the other two drugs. And that just speaks to it's prolific, it's happening, this is before legalization, it's already a problem, it already was a problem, it continues to be a concern for police. So impaired driving, weekend nights, about 10% of drivers on the roads may be impaired, and that's a statistic that's echoed not just by National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, but also by MAD Canada. The International Association of Chiefs of Police study, the average alcohol impaired driver will drive 80 times impaired per year. That's a prolific alcoholic, someone who is it's very much part of their life. It's not just the one-time police catch them, that it's an ongoing offense. And there we go, the alcohol impaired driving rates are equal to that of drug impaired driving rates. And in 2010, impaired driving cost Canadian society $20.62 billion, and that's a comprehensive cost that was released by MAD Canada in their study. That's insurance, injury, loss of work, loss of safety to families. So our main goal is to stop all impaired driving. We have proactive detection and deterrence. There's education, there's health, there's enforcement. The World Health Organization says if the police get out there and just arrest every possible impaired driver we can possibly find, and we go prolific enforcement of impaired driving, no matter how hard we work, we as the police are only going to bring down these fatalities by 20%. This is not something we can arrest our way out of. We need community support. We need that extra health and education aspect. This conversation that we're having right now is what drives down impaired driving. It can't be done by just the police. It is a community effort. What we do in the police, we use our Alberta Check Stop program, the Intox ECIR2, which is our method of detecting blood alcohol concentrations with a breath sample, standardized field sobriety tests, drug recognition experts. Basic investigations can result in an impaired driving charge and conviction. Toxicological analysis, approved drug screening equipment. That's actually a picture of me when I was working in Canmore. We're doing this is a stage picture of just public education with high schools. So context, where did we come from? 1920, they said, alcohol prohibition ends. You guys are good to go, it's now decriminalized. We had no instrument that could measure alcohol because it's a brand new thing. We had to develop technology for it. So in 1921 became a law. Driving while intoxicated by alcohol was a crime. 1925 they added driving while intoxicated by a drug being a crime. 1930 driving while intoxicated by drugs and or alcohol combined became a crime. It wasn't until 1954 that we actually had our first voluntary breath test to measure alcohol in someone's system. It took that long for technology to develop, get to Canada, and get used on a voluntary basis on our roads for detecting alcohol. 1961 Narcotic Control Act, cannabis prohibition was entered into that. And then we're looking at 50 years almost. 1969, where it actually became a law, where we established a limit of alcohol in a person's body as illegal, 50 years after alcohol prohibition ends. 1976, approved screen devices, the alcohol roadside screen device where we can test someone at a car. That became released and used by police on a widespread basis in 1976. 1995 was the very first drug recognition expert program in Canada. It was held in British Columbia. And here we are in 2008, or back in 2008, that became law. It says it was actually on a voluntary basis in 1995, and then it became law in the criminal code in 2008. And here we are, 2018, cannabis prohibition ends. Hopefully it doesn't take us 50 years to get an easy, fast, and simple, safe, and reliable method of testing for cannabis at the side of the road. So what do we do for alcohol? There's an approved screening device, and we need reasonable suspicion to believe alcohol is in a driver's body. It gives us basically 3 results. They're released, you're clear to drive. They're a warning, then they get a 3-day suspension of vehicle seizure, or to fail, they're believed to be over the legal limit and arrested for further testing. That's just preliminary roadside screening. So what is a drug? In relation to impaired driving, a drug is any substance when taken into a human body impairs a person's ability to operate a motor vehicle. So that includes alcohol, that includes cannabis, that includes prescription medications, that includes illegal drugs too. Anything. There's actually a successful conviction on the east coast of Canada where someone ingested 9 energy drinks and was driving and was convicted for it because he was absolutely on his central nervous system was overly stimulated and he was a danger to the public. So what do police need to do to test you for standardized field sobriety tests or drug impairment? We need a reasonable suspicion to believe any drug is in your body at any amount, not a specific drug, not a reasonable belief that that drug is impairing. And that can be from a multitude of events or indicators. I teach a three-week course on this, so it's hard to go through them all, but there's indications that a drug is in your body and you're not operating like a normal, sober human being, that there's something inside your body affecting your ability to be safe, and how we can determine that is through further testing. So, sobriety testing with drugs, very quick overview, right? 1921, there was alcohol prohibition ends, and police needed something. We didn't have a device or an instrument to measure alcohol, so we were doing arbitrary, random tests, picking up change, counting on your fingers, tracing your hand, and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration said, whoa, we need something that's reliable and systematic and standardized. So in 1975, they began research to create a standardized impaired driving detection process that's been refined over the years from 1977 to 1998, where the standardized field sobriety test program and drug recognition expert program were established. That has now been accepted by the Canadian Supreme Court as reliable methods of detecting this type of impairment. And we are now moving into approved drug screening equipment, which will test your saliva. So standardized field sobriety tests. They are objective observations of non-sober behavior through physical coordination tests. The way I teach it to my students is subjective is your feelings, is what you believe and what you can't really prove. Objective is tangible, reproducible evidence that can be demonstrated to a court and measured and calculated. So we use these reproducible indicia to show someone is operating as a normal sober person, or if they're not. And this was validated against alcohol because we had a standard for what was sober and what isn't sober with alcohol levels in a person's body. And the 3 tests are horizontal gaze nystagmus test, walk and turn test, and the one leg stand test. So, and the result of that is the person performs well, there's no signs of impairment, and they are released, or that they're determined to be impaired and they're arrested for impaired driving, and a drug recognition expert's called for further testing. Drug recognition experts use when reasonable grounds that a driver is impaired at a criminal level. DRE, our specially trained officers, use a 12-step international standardized and systematic process for determining if someone's impaired. Again, the cliff notes of it is that a drug recognition expert will test someone's divided attention skills. So when you're driving a car, your attention is divided against multiple things, right? Brake management, speed management, reading your odometers, interpreting other vehicles and their actions, time and distance estimation, reaction time, reviewing your mirrors. There's a lot of things going on in your brain. So we try and reproduce those by making you do divided attention tests. So walking and turning, and remembering the instructions, and remembering how many steps to take, and how to turn, and how to maintain your balance. Those are trying to mimic what you do in a car. There's also the one leg stand test. You're maintaining your balance, you're listening to instructions, you're performing a physical coordination test, you're counting out loud, you're dividing your brain's attention between multiple tasks. Normally, if you're drunk or high, you can do one thing really, really well. But as soon as you get distracted, things start to fall apart. That's the kind of indications we're looking for. Now, just because you can't perform physical tests well doesn't mean you are a criminal, right? We need to see if your body's behaving like it's on a substance or if it's not. So there are normal ranges established by this program that most sober people fall into. And it's a range. It's not everyone's 60 beats per minute heart rate. It's 60 to 90. It's a range. And certain drugs can either bring you below that range or above it. And we take a collection of data, blood pressure, pulse rate, pupil dilation in 3 lighting conditions, body temperature, muscle tone, and we put that into a matrix and go, you are on one of 7 categories of drugs, or you're not at all, or it could be a sign of a medical impairment. We do screen for if anyone's in signs of medical distress. I believe it's the next slide here. There we go. So is it drug impairment or is it a medical problem? Some signs of medical distress may look like someone is drunk or high, head trauma, stroke, MS. And we will use eye evaluations at the very start of our testing to determine if signs of that head trauma or serious medical issue is a main concern. And if it is, that's our now primary focus. We care about safety, we care about the well-being of our people. So being in a collision, one pupil can be bigger than the other. These are just preliminary things. We're not diagnosing anyone with anything. We're just going, that's a concern, and then we bring in an expert. We bring in a medical team. So what does a DRE determine? Is the subject impaired at the time of the evaluation? Is the impairment due to a drug, a medical issue, or a physiological issue? And then which category or categories of drugs are causing that impairment? So there are certain, even cough medicines that have a strong potency or drugs in them when you take too much of it. That's a central nervous system depressant. Dextromethorphan is the one, and that's a dissociative anesthetic that's in cough syrup. That's a crack pipe beside it. The little pretty cactus is a hallucinogenic cactus called peyote. There's a heroin rig. Prescription pills like Xanax are commonly abused and do pose a risk to people if they're driving on them. A lot of people would associate the picture of the green bottle with beer, but coming up to 2019, there's lots of companies that have stated they're going to be releasing beverage THC. And then, of course, cannabis there. It's actually a picture of my dad. Yeah. He's not a Mountie, he just dressed up as one once. We're talking about the future here. Okay, so the new laws coming out. Bill C-46, Part 1 and 2. Part 1 already passed. This is a new regime of impaired driving laws that passed in June there. Police can take blood to determine your blood alcohol content of certain drugs. They're defined by regulations. There's 10 right now, and it's only going to grow from there as limits are established. So blood has the strongest evidence because that's what's actively moving through your body and going through your brain. That can be analyzed by a lab, by a toxicological analysis. And there's a new criminal code regulations for that. Police can even demand blood for any driver involved in a serious collision up to 8 hours after driving if that person is suspected to have drugs or alcohol in the body. There's a lot of new laws that are coming out that are trying to make the public safer and hold impaired drivers accountable. They're not consuming drugs or claiming they consume drugs after killing someone. Okay, here are the 10 drugs. We have THC, there's 2 levels established by the criminal code. There's a 2 nanogram limit, and then there's a 5 nanogram limit. LSD, which is acid, lysergic acid, diethylamide, psilocybin, psilocin, those are magic mushrooms. PCP, 6 monoacetylmorphine is a metabolite of heroin. Ketamine, cocaine, methamphetamine. Those are zero tolerance, cannot have any of that in your body. They're illegal. They have no business being in you while you're driving. So the government said those are not okay. If it's in your body and you're driving, that's a danger to the public. And there's no way we can possibly establish limits considering that they are illegal drugs. And gamma hydroxybutyrate is actually a naturally occurring substance in your body, but it cannot naturally be above a 5 milligram per liter of blood level. So, some of the fines, for 2 nanograms of THC or less, it's a maximum fine of $1,000. All those other limits, 5 nanograms of THC or anything of the zero tolerance drugs, or even alcohol, minimum fine of $1,000 and up to life imprisonment if it's impaired driving causing death. There's even a tiered system for alcohol content, and it increases with that level of alcohol content. Or even a mixture of 2.5 nanograms or more of THC and 50 milligrams or more of alcohol. When those smaller amounts are combined, they create a greater impairing effect. And that's unanimous across the world that science is been echoed, that you mix small amounts of THC and alcohol, that those combine and actually increase each other's effect on your body and actually fight for supremacy in your brain and create a greater impairing effect and increase that THC absorption. Bill C-46 Part 2. This starts December 18th, 2018, so we're almost a month away here. Mandatory alcohol screening. So across the world, it's been acknowledged that impaired driving is a leading cause of crime-related preventable deaths on our road. Police officers will be able to approach a vehicle, demand license, registration, insurance, and a breath sample. We will no longer need reasonable suspicion that alcohol is in a driver's body. The driver will just be required, mandated to provide a breath sample into an approved screening device. And the increases in impaired driving sanctions with new mandatory minimum fines are coming out next month. This is going to be a huge undertaking. This has been adopted by multiple countries, and it has had a significant impact on decreasing deaths on our roadways. Okay, thank you very much for listening to me for so long. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. I know the only thing standing between you and a good lunch is us up here, but we've got about 10 minutes left, and as a result of some of the information that was presented, I'm confident there's probably some questions that you may have to some of our panelists here. Please, we have 2 mics there. I'd like you to take advantage of utilizing those, and please, if you're looking for one of the panelists, just advise which one you're directing the questions to. Thank you.
Sir.
I guess my question would be to Dwayne. What is our best way as a council for our First Nation that wants to see our community members have their shops that they want, but also to make our community safe and so that our community members aren't getting arrested, but it's also a safety message for the users?
So it is working. So I think the responsibility is on all of us, right? I think the leaders in your communities, in all of our communities, as well as the organizations, whether it's your own standalone First Nation Police Service or one of our partners, whether it's the RCMP or the OPP or the Sûreté de Québec, depending on what part of the country you come from, I think you have to get together and you have to have a discussion about these things. I think you have to create laws in your own community to legislate this and to regulate it, right? Because at the bottom line in all this is the safety and security of the people in our communities, right? I mean, we don't want to sacrifice that, just so we can make a buck. It's not about that. I don't think it's about that. I don't think anybody wants to sacrifice the health and safety of people in our communities or anyone else. So I think you have to really get together and have an open and honest discussion about where it is you want to go with all of this.
Excellent, thank you. Anybody else want to give their ideas? I'm from Ontario, just so you know. And we've also had 2 police officers that stole marijuana from one of their catches, and they were both let go from the police department. So after they called the police on themselves. So.
Well, theft is still a crime, right?
I would like to comment as well on that, as I think that question is very valid when we're looking at what we need to do. Remember, from a police officer's perspective, this has been a drug that's been illegal for many years. Some of us were on drug sections and we were taking down illegal grows. It had criminality involved, organized crime most often than not. But this is a perspective change for us too. So what we look to, and I know in our community, is we have strong leadership, we have community members, and there's a dialogue that goes on. And also a big part of what is important, and Sarah brought this up, it's about legislation. It's about your legislation to support what the community, what the leadership wants to do. And I think those are amazing conversations to have, and it's actually really incredible to go to band meetings and hear what the community has to say. And as a police officer, that's an important thing to do, is to listen to that. Could I ask the next question?
Hi, my name's Linda Stromberg. I'm with the National Institute for Cannabis Health and Education from British Columbia, and recently we had some news, I'm not sure if it was nationwide or specific to BC, that since October 17th, there has been no appreciable increase in cannabis-affected driving, which is really good news. And I'm just wondering, particularly from Chief Zachary's perspective, what you're seeing on First Nations
Sure. So First Nation communities for years and years and years, and for my entire career, we've seen lots of impaired driving, right? We've seen lots of impaired driving from alcohol, and we've dealt with impaired driving from drugs over the past. We've talked to our partners or our members, right, of the First Nations Police Association, Chiefs of Police Association, sorry, and the information that we're getting, and I'll go back to what Chief Blake had said earlier. October 17th, right, we were all kind of, well, what's going to happen? The sky's falling, that sort of thing. October 17th came and went. Here we are a month later, and there hasn't been the big dramatic change that we thought was going to happen, but still we have to be responsible about it. We have to ensure that our members, the police officers in our communities, are properly trained, they have the proper equipment, and they're capable of doing the job that they need to do to keep each and every one of us safe, right? Because that's paramount. At the same time, right, we all have to work together to make sure that this works for all of us. We need to increase education. I don't see enough education happening out there right now. I know people have spoken about it, and I know it's happening, but on a small level. So we need to broaden that. We need to talk to people, we need to get out there, and we need to talk to people about the effects that cannabis and its derivatives will have on people. I mean, look at all of the things that have happened with alcohol, right? And Chief Blake again said something. For years and years and years, this was something that was illegal, and we dealt with it over the years, whether it was through organized crime or on the smaller, like dealer network trafficking, that type of thing. So now we have to deal with it. It's legal in this country, right? And many of our communities want to get in on the ground level and do something from an economic standpoint, but at the same time, safety and security of our people is paramount.
Thank you.
Hello, Dean Seneca. I'm a former health scientist with the CDC and CEO of Seneca Scientific Solutions. A couple points to the presentation that I think are a little misleading. One is, yes, cannabis at 30% THC extraction, but that's at the extreme. That's not the average. The average is more like 15%. So I think you need to kind of say that. I mean, of 30%, people are not using that on a daily basis, in one of the slides. The other slide that you have, I think you really need to remove, and that is the one that said alcohol increases the THC inhibitors. First off, there's no research to actually say that or anything accurate, because you would have to say, once you put alcohol into any mixture of anything, it really is an alcohol-related issue. You can't say that alcohol increases the cocaine inhibitors or an opioid inhibitor, because it's vice versa. You could say, well, maybe the THC increased the alcohol inhibitor. We can't say with accuracy because we really don't know, and it's not researched. So that slide really should be removed from your presentation because it's a little misleading. I think there's a lot of science there that is kind of skeptical that you're presenting, and I think we need to stay with what is accurate and scientifically, statistically significant. Just my comments.
No, I absolutely appreciate this type of conversation, because this is the information I'm provided. I meant it's up to 30% in some of the plants when they're extremely well grown with hydroponics and all the advanced research behind it. Absolutely, it varies. It can be 3%, it can be up to 30%. In terms of, I didn't mean, if I did say inhibitors, I'm absolutely sorry. It just increases the absorption rate of the active THC when alcohol and THC are mixed. And the research that I've been provided, it says that the impairing effects of small amounts of THC and small amounts of alcohol create the same level of impairment as one larger quantity of one of the substances by themselves.
Yeah, but you can't say the impairment could be alcohol. It might not be THC. The combined effects, yes, but we have never ever measured or even assessed the cocktail effect of any of these substances. So you can't say like, okay, if you're smoking THC and you drink alcohol, it's going to increase your THC, and vice versa. If you're drinking alcohol then use THC, you can't say that it's going to increase your alcohol level. You cannot say that with accuracy. So the information you're getting is incorrect, and it really should not be displayed because it's not statistically significant. You haven't proven, there's not evidence there in research to prove that either or is the effect. I could say that yes, a person has had and used THC, But if they go and drink, 6 or 8 drinks, they're impaired because of the alcohol, not because of the THC. What I'm saying is that when you really talk about the cocktail effect of substances, you can't say that the THC was inhibited. Could you say that the cocaine was inhibited? I mean, you just cannot say that with accuracy, so it's misleading.
And again, I appreciate your comments, and I think what we're trying to say here is this is information that is very skimpy at best. We don't have the evidence. There hasn't been research because it has been a legal drug. So point well taken, and thank you for that. So just moving towards the next question.
Hi, Byron Walwier, Red Rock Bend. I seen a number you had up there, the 5 nanograms. What gets you 5 nanograms?
So, just to be clear, I am only presenting what the new laws are. I don't have the research to back it up. I just teach what the laws are to police officers and how to detect if someone is impaired. And then what we do is once they're determined to be impaired, we make the conclusion that that impairment is caused by a drug at the time of the evaluation. A bodily fluid sample is taken, be that saliva, urine, or blood. That sample is then analyzed. We do not charge anyone until after that sample is analyzed. It agrees with our call, our opinion, and the whole totality of the investigation lays out the evidence that an impaired driving offense has been committed. It's a lengthy process. Lab analysis of these samples does take a long time, but it has to be accurate, and we don't take chances in Alberta of will this match our opinion or will this match the indicators that were observed during the evaluation. So if it is blood and it is those limits, then that will speak to a secondary or another offense on top of the impaired behavior.
That didn't really answer my question, but thanks.
I can't answer why the 5 nanograms was established. I can just say that that is the law.
Thank you. Another question, please.
Just to continue on the same theme about the difficulties of testing THC and knowing that we're truly understanding the effects on a driver. A quick Google search shows some very contradictory information. As an example, it's been published that motor vehicle collisions in Nevada have actually dropped by 10% since the legalization of cannabis in that state. And so basically my question is, what kind of conversation is happening within the police forces regarding the truly nuanced approach that will be necessary to actually integrate the science behind the cannabis use? Because people are too informed and educated to treat it as an analog to alcohol. Another example is people who are used to using high levels of THC. It actually doesn't impair their driving because of their bodies become acclimatized and accustomed. Another issue, THC use staying in the system for a whole month after ingestion. How can the police fairly address these truly nuanced issues when it comes to cannabis use and driving?
So we look for impairment at the time of the evaluation based on our research. I would absolutely love an instrument that is able to just determine the same level of evidentiary value as we do with alcohol. That would be amazing. And we are now scientists are now able to ethically test people on cannabis and establish these limits. We're doing the best we can with the laws that have been established and what has been accepted by the Supreme Court of Canada. And that's all we have to go for. We can't deviate from those, and I'm very receptive to change and improvements on this system.
Thank you. We are running out of time, so we have one more question, please.
Tansei, good afternoon. My name is Jeff Frank. I'm from the Beaver Lake Cree Nation. So just mainly comments in regards to the testing and also what I see as criminalization before actual prosecution of individuals. So First Nations people and the RCMP have had tenuous relationships at best throughout history. You know, the RCMP were a paramilitary organization who forced people onto our reserves to enforce essentially derogatory things against our people. So in that capacity here, I'm thinking that, roadside tests, I think this can be a constitutional challenge to that. Further to that, at the same time, I think 2 nanograms per liter of blood is kind of just, I don't know how that baseline was established, but the Olympic Committee defines impairment 75 to 150 milligrams per liter of blood. So I think in that capacity here, I see fines, demanding of blood is going to erode the relationship amongst First Nations people and the RCMP and other police forces, and it's already tenuous as is. So my issue is this, that people who don't have the means or the capacity to pay a fine is going to criminalize them and going to place more of our people in jail. And so that's my inherent fear right now with these laws coming down. I don't know if they've been properly vetted or properly, and there's no real research, as the moderator has said, we're learning on the go. So I think it's highly irresponsible of government and of police services to be moving forward in such a way, especially with First Nations populations who are essentially targeted, and because of English as a second language, different cultural understandings comparatively to Canadiana. So in that respect here, I'm very concerned that First Nations people are going to be targeted at a higher rate and be subject to criminal systems. With your impaired driver, you can go to court and pay $5,000 and walk away. So those are some of my concerns.
These laws, if I may, these laws are just as new to us, the RCMP, it is to the First Nations people. We need to get it right. And we need to build those bridges to collaboration and communication. And that's what I'm advocating today, is that this is a community and police effort. With the community, First Nations community, we can come up to a proper level of policing in the First Nations communities that we do serve today here in Alberta. So it's a collaboration between police and community. And that's the approach we'd like to take.
I do understand and respect your opinion, but at the same time, I think even with the Draeger 5000 here, and they had the rep the other day coming in saying, this is our science, and there's no other side of the coin to that conversation yesterday. Right now, the Draeger 5000 is controversial in the sense that is it sound science? There's false negative, false positive tests. You have to be within the car for it to be within that temperature range for it to be properly tested. And so I think in that respect here too, I think that's what the constitutional challenge is going to become to people's rights, is that's it's going to be happening. So I think in that sense, I think police forces and government are getting ahead of themselves in the sense that these new laws are going to be impacting the most at-risk people. And I think in that respect, that's highly irresponsible of government. And to demand blood and to demand after 8 hours, they say you smoke cannabis, 4 hours to leave the system. You ingest it, it takes 6 hours to leave the system. So I think in that respect, you can demand blood, but every individual in here can say, no, you don't have to take my blood. That is of my person and of my being, and I'm not going to be giving you my blood if you demand it. Further to that, I think, again, it's just, I think the science is still developing, and it has to be a collaborative process saying it's better not, what's the best way to drive? Drive sober. But then I think, in regards to cannabis and people who are medically taking it, they can be unfairly subject to laws that are still evolving.
So we need to educate.
Those are excellent points, and I think what we have to remember is the overrepresentation of the Indigenous in incarceration. It spreads across whatever those offenses are, and this is where, again, these discussions need to be had. So thank you for your points. We are running out of time. In fact, we were over time, so as a moderator, I would like to thank Sarah for her presentation and her valued input. Dwayne, again, thank you so much for your passion. Earl, thank you for your comments, and Richard for the presentation, and thank you all for listening.
Yes, thank you very much, Keith. And I just want to maybe make a quick point here that, the law enforcement side of the cannabis and the cannabis landscape in our communities, I'm looking at this and I can see that there's really no heavy-handed approach, and there's a real neutrality, if you will, but an unpreparedness that's indicative of how the federal government has pushed this legislation through. And, my hat's off to law enforcement that are, taking the approach that, there's a lot to learn here. Just note there that on the panel, and I want to thank the panel, that there were all law enforcement people there. And notice that Sarah, I think she may have been the only lawyer up there, but in our culture, the Makwa Dodem, the Bear Clan people are the protectors. So she was in her element and very much part of her peers. So again, let's give them a big round of applause, and thank you very much. Looking forward to ongoing work and efforts. Just a couple housekeeping items. We are behind time, and unfortunately, as the moderator, I've got to make a bit of a call here. So we're going to have lunch now, and we're going to dial this back, and we'll only be deficit 15 minutes. If we have our lunch now, we go to 1:15, and we're going to get into the next session after that. Just a note from the organizers at the front desk: if you have registered and paid for an off-site tour tomorrow and have not been notified of your bus color, please see the registration desk to be included, and we appreciate your cooperation. So again, have a good lunch, and we'll see you back here at 1:15. Miigwech.